Yeah.
Good to go? Okay. All right, so I know today and tomorrow there's going to be like less and less people. How many people are planning to like start their vacations early tomorrow? So if you're here, great. I think we're going to get done with pretty much everything that I want to get done, except for Bismarck. And I am going to save Bismarck for tomorrow because that's like wicked super important. All right. But what I mentioned yesterday is that the chapter that we're doing now, the last part of this unit, is politics. And literally what it's doing is it's picking up the story in every country from the 1848 revolutions. And pretty much every country is affected by the 1848 revolutions except for maybe Russia. And that's why we'll deal with Russia like in one massive 100-year period. And we'll do that after the break. But today we're going to at least pick up the story in France and Italy. And Italy doesn't exist yet, but we're going to get to the place where it does. And then there's two key figures that are involved in what they call the age of Realpolitik. There's actually three, but two of them we're going to talk about today. One of them is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who is known as Napoleon III, or Nappy III, who is the nephew of Uncle Napoleon Bonaparte, the original B, the OB. All right, and then we're going to talk about a guy named Count Camillo Benzo di Cavour, who was the premier of a region called Piedmont, and that was one of the many city-states that comprised Italy. So go to Unit 7, and then in notes, you're going to go to Chapter 24 notes, even though it's Chapter 23.
Is politics with a K?
It is, but I call them the Realpoliticians,
Oh.
and I don't think I can do that with a K, so I'm just going to do it that way. But this is what the notes look like, and I'm going to try to at least cover the 1848 revolutions in these different places so that you remember at least what the story is and what they inherited. So France, does anybody remember what the 1848 revolution looked like in France? And one of the things that I forgot to mention, and I should have, because I think it was really imperative that we did, was that the 1840s is referred to as the Hungry 40s. Okay, it wasn't just the Irish potato famine, but there was generally a bad climate and bad harvest pretty much all over Europe. So people were struggling regardless of whether they were Irish potato people or not. And that means that France would have found itself confronting a similar situation that they might have confronted in 1789, where you had a whole bunch of poor people that were probably taking to the streets of Paris and were protesting high bread prices, probably high unemployment, probably high inflation, and a variety of other things. You don't have revolutions unless the lower classes are agitated about something. You're not going to be able to do it with just a bunch of, thinking liberals that were like, hey, the Constitution isn't really working for us. All right? You need the energy of the sans-culotte in order to make something like that happen. So it was one of those confluence of events where liberals, classical liberals, those that saw that Louis Philippe, the July monarch, was acting very much like an old monarch in France, where the majority of the electorate was ignored or had no access to the political process, that the Constitution was a ruse, that landowning aristocrats really dominated most of the political decision making. So you're going to have that end of it. The liberal, bourgeois liberals, classical liberals that want a bourgeois liberal revolution in France. And then in knowing that at one time they had one, but France relegated back to an earlier period. All right, the conservative order is still in play in 1848 in France. The liberals recognize that that conservative order is excluding them from the political process. So ideally what they're looking for is a revolution that will go to the bourgeois phase, meaning something like what America went through in the 1770s and 80s, or what France itself went through from 1789 to 91. But the other reality, and the one that's the most important here, is that France is 50 years forward from its original revolution now. And in that process, they've gone through the Industrial Revolution, which means that there is more urbanization and there are more concentrations of workers in various cities around France. And France has gone through some socialism. Remember, the 1830s is dominated by utopian socialists like Charles Fourier and the Count Henri de Saint-Simon and Louis Blanc and a handful of others. There might even be a little Marx and Engels floating around in France. Okay, so there's a working class consciousness. They see property as an evil, and so their conceptual consequence of the revolution would be something that would produce a socialist society where property is distributed evenly and the working class has a voice. And that's what happens. In the 1848 revolutions, they all hate the conservatives. So that's easy. Okay, rebel against the conservatives. Louis Philippe abdicates. Where does he go? Witness Protection Program. Where is it? England. All right. So he's gone. All right. Exit another monarch. What is that, like 5 or so? And now they're at the drawing table figuring out what they're going to do. They declare themselves a second republic. Okay. So France's second republic begins in 1848. But immediately, that liberal bourgeois element and then the socialist working, is it beeping or something?
Yeah. No, it's my laptop.
It's your laptop. Okay. Immediately, those two divisions that I was talking about are going to come to a head. The liberal bourgeoisie is going to try to hijack the revolution to frame it into what they wanted it to be, which unfortunately means laissez-faire economics, the protection of private property, all right, and all of those things, and a working class that is jobless, that is hungry, that desperately needs a reorientation of policies to benefit the working class, and they're going to start clashing. And that's why eventually it takes all of about 3 months before there is a major civil war in France. It's called the June Days Revolt. And it's basically pitting France against Paris. All right? The working class that is organized around Paris against the liberals, the army, and then a handful of peasants who had received property and now hear like the redistribution of property, and they don't like that. So you actually found a way of bringing the peasants and the liberal bourgeoisie together. Okay? So you hear about it. The June Days Revolt was violent as hell. There was more death in the June Days Revolt than there was in France at any time since the Reign of Terror. Okay? So they're in a bad trouble. Right? So read this. It says, French politicians represent special interest groups, particularly middle-class ones. When they ran a parliamentary democracy, okay, Congress, they stirred up class hatred because they were not interested in helping the poor. So the response to this, because the alternative was civil war, and they said, we don't want that, okay? Ideally, we want this liberal bourgeois order that will represent our interests, but we realize that that's not going to happen. We're going to be stuck in civil war. So ultimately, society as a whole, in a condition of vulnerability, is going to look for an authoritarian. Somebody that will come along and say, I'll take care of everybody. Okay? I say this now because I think that society recently has gone through some of those formulations. I think that we've gotten to places where we believe that parliamentary democracy doesn't work, that special interests dominate political parties and they're only looking out after themselves and not necessarily after the people that matter. And so if there's a charismatic personality that can come along and say, I will take care of you, I can fix you, or I can fix this, that people are willing to surrender to that authority. Okay? And it just so happens in France around the same time that there's a cat rolling around with a last name Bonaparte. And they remember Napoleon. Not all the bad of Napoleon, like I tried to take over the world and failed. But the good of Napoleon, where he had actually, during a time of tumult, had actually worked to make sure that the middle class, the working class, even the old aristocrats, the peasants, everybody was included in the project. If Napoleon didn't get grand designs on taking over the world, he probably would have gone down as being a pretty damn good politician. All right, the work that he did in domestic policy by strengthening the banks, building an education and university system, building infrastructure, public works, et cetera, giving people rights, supporting the night of August the 4th stuff that went down in 1789. If he had done all that and didn't say, I think I'm going to go on this messianic, take Britain out or so help me God kind of thing, and then crash in Russia, I think we would have looked at Napoleon and said, dude, you were a really, really good politician that fixed France. And the way that Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was carrying himself was that he would be Napoleon without the take over the world complex. Right? He sells himself as just a modern liberal in the late 1840s. The works that he writes are almost entirely based on domestic policy. He had one that was called Napoleonic Ideas, but it was more about how do you confront problems that face France. And then he had another one called The Elimination of Poverty. That sounds pretty good. I think people would want to get rid of poverty. All right? And they're looking back and saying, all right, he is the figure that we're willing to surrender to. All right, we need a strong executive. The legislature is going to go back and forth and nothing's going to get done. Okay? We got to fix the problems that we have. We have joblessness, we've got high bread prices, we've got a whole bunch of other things. Somebody needs to come in and fix it. He comes in and immediately he's on his game. All right. So much so that 3 years later he says, I just want to be president. And then 3 years later he's like, I think I want to be president for life. And then a year after that he's like, screw it, I think I just want to be emperor. And that they were down with it. They liked it. And the reason why they liked it is because if you looked at him in the 1850s, it was like win after win after win after win for France. Okay? Here's what it is. All right? Yes, he had dictator stuff. He censored the press. He was his elections were kind of a sham. It's like the election is like 12,500,000 for Napoleon, like 3,000 for write-in candidate that opposes him. All right, but he's doing the work. All right, what did he have to do? He had to fix the economy. All right, and he does that in a variety of different ways. Big-time economic expansion, created two finance corporations. One's called the Crédit Mobilier, the other is called the Crédit Foncier. All right, that are providing government-backed support to build railroads, to improve utilities, to improve the agricultural sector, to improve the industrial sector, to improve the education sector. One of them was like New Deal on steroids, was literally to rebuild Paris. That was one of the prime objectives of the 1850s. He found this stud Alsatian architect by the name of George Haussmann, who completely rebuilt the city. So the old city was overcrowded, it had bad sanitation, it had bad infrastructure, and they completely rebuilt it. They widened the boulevards, they started to redistrict it, they had parks that were put in to get rid of some of the pollution. It was a gorgeous city by the time it was done. And to think of the number of jobs that you would create just in the project of rebuilding a city. So immediately it's like the WPA, And so all these working class people now have jobs. The industries are booming. The agricultural sector is stable again, which means that bread prices are going to be low. Okay? He's not going to get rid of private property, but that's okay. All right? Because the working class is getting a big piece of modern liberal cheese, right? So they're not so concerned with reorienting society to be like a propertyless society. It's like they'll take the compromise, and he was winning on that compromise. Yeah.
Was France still in debt at this point? Because if they were employing all of those workers that you just mentioned, was it contributing to their debt?
At least in the short term, sure. Just like the United States, I would say that Roosevelt was running debts in the early to mid 1930s, and definitely was running debts when they were trying to pay for the war. By the time you get to the 50s and 60s, the economy's booming and then they're paying off those debts. All right. Napoleon is winning. France is winning. All right. And here's my analogy, okay? It's like he's in Vegas and he's playing roulette, right? And like every time he's got like a number. It's like, I don't know, I'm going to play red 23. And so he keeps putting chips on red 23. And then the ball will roll around and it keeps landing on 23. Right? And he's like, oh, and then there's like stacks and stacks of chips that are added to those chips. And then he'll put those chips down. And then there'll be stacks and stacks of chips. And before long, he's just like gassed with how much he's winning. All right? What's the one mistake that people make when they're winning and gambling? They can't stop. All right? They're like, this luck is going to go on forever. And they often will go to some other thing that they're not as good at and think they will be equally successful in what they're not good at. Okay? So he's got all these chips in a roulette. And roulette represents domestic policy. He's very good at it. Okay? He's winning. All kinds of chips. Just either stay and play roulette or cash in. Okay? Just chill it out. But around 1860, it was like he started reading about Uncle Napoleon and how great Uncle Napoleon was at conquering countries and building France into a massive empire. And he's like, nobody's ever going to remember me if I don't build France into an empire. Okay? So they were messing around in Algeria and all these other places in Africa. They were starting to get involved in these commercial ventures in the Caribbean. They were starting to get out there. But he's like, yeah, but Napoleon, Uncle Nappy, I mean, that dude, he had all of continental Europe under his control. And so now he starts venturing out in foreign policy. And this is like the craps table. And he starts laying some of those roulette chips down on craps. He starts putting it on the pass line or whatever else. And this comes in the form of foreign policy objectives where France is going to start meddling in international affairs. The first thing that he does is kind of benign. He'll put like 3 or 4 chips down on the craps table. It's a treaty that he signs with Great Britain called the Cobden Treaty. And at the time, he's like, you know what, France's industries, we've been at it for about 15, 20 years. We're feeling very good about our industries. Let's start lowering the tariff barriers between us and Britain, allow the free exchange of goods. Thinking that we're just as good as Britain now. Britain will bring their goods into our markets, but we can bring our goods into their markets. Britain kicked the shit out of them, okay, in a free trade relationship. They've been doing it longer and better. Okay? And so now the French markets are being flooded with British goods that are better, higher quality, cheaper, more quantity, and the French consumers are buying British stuff instead of buying French stuff. And the outward part was not true. Okay? So now they got a trade deficit. And a whole bunch of French manufacturers are now suffering when otherwise they wouldn't have been. And now everybody's looking at Napoleon. And you see the craps dealer just kind of go with that little cane and swoop in all the chips. And then what do you do when you gamble and you lose? Hey, I gotta get a win. I can't leave here until I get a win. So then he's like, well, I just lost like 200 chips. I'm going to put down 400 so that if I win, I'll get 800. So his next venture is bigger. It's like, I got to erase the stain of us having this bad trade relationship by getting a victory that all the French people will say, that's the Napoleon that I remember. That dude's a winner. He decides to intervene in Mexico. And the idea was that France could literally like swoop in and make Mexico like a puppet government and install his own leader that would control Mexico in France's interests. Okay? Why do it in 1863?
Oh, that's
They have independence for the fine.
What's the U.S. into? Because it's a complete violation of the Monroe Doctrine, right? Okay. And the U.S. is the only one that really has the arsenal that could really deal with it. Right? But the U.S. is into something.
the second one.
The Civil War.
Oh.
They're smack dab in the middle of the Civil War. And so he's like, we'll just come sweep in the back here. All right, and we'll get involved in Mexico, and the U.S. is too consumed with the war of northern aggression, or whatever the Confederates call it, and that we'll be able to take Mexico. Easy peasy, man. France versus Mexico, done. The Mexicans kick the crap out of the French. All right, And then you can see like that. All of the world's newspapers are like Mexico hands France. It's you know what? All right, Napoleon, the guy whose uncle conquered more territory in shorter amounts of time than anybody in the history of the world, except for Alexander the Great, just lost to Mexico. Okay, it's like the Cavs losing by 20 points to the Magic. It would never happen.
But
All right.
it did.
But it did.
Go Magic.
All right, so anyway, that's another loss, and it's a big sandwich, and he's got to take a bite. And now everybody, like he's watching his approval ratings, and if you said Napoleon approval ratings circa 1858, Napoleon's got it going on, right? And then the guy comes with the cane and grabs those 400 chips. And now Napoleon's like, dude, I need a win. I really need a win. So then the next thing that he does is he's invited to a win. It's like somebody sits down next to him and says, hey, dude, you can play my chips. All right? And that is this Camillo Cavour, who I'm going to talk about in just a second. So Cavour sits down, and basically the deal was this. There was a semi-win in the 1850s. Okay? And it comes in the form of this Crimean War that was like the natural, inevitable conclusion to this Russian foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean meets British and French checks. So Britain and France had sent forces in to deal, but primarily Britain had dealt with Russia and the Crimea. But this Cavour from Sardinia, Piedmont, also sent some troops into the Crimean War so that he could pitch this deal of Italian unification. And the person that was listening to this conversation about Italian unification was Napoleon. Because Napoleon's like, so you're saying that the Italians want unification, but Austria controls large territories or some specific city-states like Lombardy and Venice and others. So if you can remove Austrian influence, your argument is that you guys will be able to unify the country and call it Italy or something. And Napoleon's like, well, what's in it for me? And Cavour's like, glad you asked. If you help us, we'll give you Nice and Savoy. And so Napoleon's like, damn, territories. Nice and Savoy, Uncle Napoleon had those. I could get them back. Then my popularity will skyrocket. So France sends in troops to support the Italians in their unification efforts. And so they quickly start defeating the Austrians and take over Venice and Lombardy. But what they did not count on was that the Papal States is controlled by the Pope. And the Pope is freaking out about the possibility that the Papal States are going to get enveloped into this big Italian unified state, and that the Pope is going to become like a secondary actor in a territory he's controlled since the donation of Pepin. Okay? So the Pope is like saber rattling about it and saying, anybody that supports this thing is not a real Catholic. You know? It turns out France is full of Catholics. Right? And the Pope is angry. And the reason why the Pope is angry is because of things that Napoleon is doing in Italy. So the French Catholics are like, yo, what up? What are we doing? And now he's got to explain, hey, I was trying to win a couple of territories so I could look like a badass for y'all. And they're like, don't upset the Pope. That's not cool. So Napoleon has, in a humiliating fashion, has to back out of his support of Cavour and sign a separate peace treaty with the Austrians. Okay? And then he loses. He gets nothing. All right? So it's one loss, and here comes the cane. More craps chips. The last part of the story, which is the best one, is that he picks a fight with the crap master. Okay? And the crap master happens to be the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Okay? And Bismarck effectively is like, dude, how many chips you got left? Yeah, you really need to win, don't you? Here's what I would do. I'd put them all in. Yeah, you're definitely going to win. I mean, you've been on a losing streak. I mean, the odds are with you that you're eventually going to win. So why don't you just put all your chips down? I don't know, put it on like 6. All right? And Napoleon's like, dude, you think so? Like, Bismarck, yeah, for sure you're going to win. Okay. Now, when you watch how that plays out, Bismarck knows he's going to lose. But he's convincing Napoleon that he's got to play this hand. All right, he's got to play this role, whatever it is. And then he's going to crap out. All right. And Bismarck's the house. He's going to get all the chips. So that's what ends up happening. Okay. If Napoleon just would have played roulette, he might have gone down in history as the best modern French president ever. But he didn't. He played craps. And he crapped out to the crap master. Au revoir. Yes.
So what happened with Germany?
Eventually, Germany literally egged France into a war against Germany. Okay, which effectively unified Germany. And then Germany invaded France and then captured Napoleon. And Napoleon had to abdicate. And he lost everything.
What was the war over?
It's called the Franco-Prussian War. The war really wasn't over anything. The war was like something that Bismarck orchestrated to get France, because remember that the old Napoleon invaded the German states a bunch of times. And so when he was able to maneuver a situation where France had to declare war on these German states, and then all Bismarck had to do in order to get the rest of the southern German states to unify with the rest of the German states, all he had to do was say, another Napoleon's going to invade y'all, what you going to do? And then he absolutely mowed him down.
So it was what could you say it was like a nationalism?
Oh, totally. Yeah, but I mean, it was Bismarck literally just, I mean, like you're the dummy on the street that's playing the shell game. And he always knows that you're never going to get the ball under the shell, right? It's totally a rigged game. All right, and this guy's so desperate because he's like that like addicted gambler that's just lost so many times. He's like, maybe just one roll. I'll win it all back. I promise. You know, all of his creditors are after him. You know, he's had to surrender like all of his dictator powers away. He's like granted all these concessions, you know, to the parliament again. Like he's a puppet of what he was, you know, at the end. And it was really sad because he was so good in domestic policy, but he was a moron when it came to foreign policy. And it was just somewhere in the reaches he recognized that he was a Bonaparte. He's like, you know, he ends up disgraced. Okay, let's look at Italy then. Okay, so Italy in the 1848 revolutions was about a couple of things. I mean, there was liberals in there that wanted to have a constitutional government, but the biggest force was nationalism. They recognized that they've been separated into these city-states forever, and that there's been foreign occupiers that have controlled Italy since the fall of the Roman Empire. Right? And so the idea that Italian people could be unified together into one coherent political thing, that was a dream that a lot of people had. Right? But Giuseppe Mazzini founded organizations to try to build it. He kind of conceptualized it in like a Jeffersonian kind of way. You had activists that were demonstrating for it. You had freedom fighters like Giuseppe Garibaldi that were willing to fight and die for it. And so the 1848 revolutions roll around, and they get a concession that basically says, dude, blueprint it. We will grant this liberal constitution that you want. It's called the Statuto of 1848. But it's going to involve an uprising that will overthrow Austrian influence and everybody else. And when they did initially overthrow Austrian influence and get Metternich out of their business and everything else, then they fought amongst themselves about what would that Italy look like. If we create it, how is it going to roll? Is it going to be a republic, the way that Mazzini had understood it? Is it going to be like a monarchy? And if so, who's going to be the monarch? Should we have since the Pope is around, and the Pope is only going to sign off if the Pope has political power, should we make the Pope the head of Italy? So there were all these blueprints for what it would look like, and while they were fighting amongst themselves about what that was going to be, the Austrians raised a big-ass army and came in and wiped them out. And then they got nothing. So out of the ash heap of all that, Garibaldi ended up leaving, and he went to like South America and became a freedom fighter in like the like Amazonian jungle. And had a whole bunch of these renegades that he called the red shirts, and they would just run around fighting for freedom as a concept. All right. So out of this came a pragmatist by the name of Camillo Cavour. And he's like, if we're going to do this, we've got to do it in a very slow and a methodical way, and ultimately we're going to need help. All right. We can't like toe-to-toe with the Austrians. Okay? At least not at that point. And at least he didn't think so. So the first thing that he's going to do is like, let's just shore up where we're at. All right. And in where he was at was this region called Piedmont. There's this region called Sardinia Piedmont. And it had a constitutional monarchy with a king by the name of Victor Emmanuel II. So it functions the way like England would function, where you have a king that is kind of like the ad hoc ruler, and then you had a governor that takes on the role of prime minister. In Italy, it was called a premier. And in Italy, in Piedmont, Camillo Cavour becomes that premier. Okay, so he goes about the business in the 1850s of building Piedmont, or Sardinia Piedmont, into a really, really awesome place. Like, he wants it to be like the best of Europe. So he's like following almost what Napoleon is doing in France in the 1850s. He's doing in Sardinia Piedmont, building up banking systems, encouraging foreign investment, building railroads, establishing a merchant marine, forming seaports, and turning it into a real financial and commercial center, something that like the Netherlands would be proud of. Okay. So now he's got the backing, this is a flourishing place. And then he says, all right, from here, now we got to make our move. Because the ultimate goal is unification, but we're going to need help with that unification. And I'm not even convinced that Cavour wanted like all of Italy, like the whole boot. I think what he wanted was like some kind of hybrid of northern and central Italy that he could put together in a unified state and then call that Italy. Okay, something that would be centered around Sardinia, Piedmont, Milan, Venice, Genoa, Lombardy, that area. Okay, so he does this genius thing. He's like, let's just get in everybody's face. And he uses the Crimean War as an opportunity to do that. Okay? And I use Kevin Durant as a verb in this case. But he Durants the Crimean War. All right? He joins a team that is made up of the French and British Navy against Russia. All right? In the Crimea. That's going to be a win. All right? Britain's Navy against Russia. That's not fair. Okay? Sardinia Piedmont sends a force to help the French and the British defeat the Russians. And that's an inevitable thing. Okay? So that when they get done and they go to the peace treaty and they're like, hey, yo, man, thank you, Sardinia Piedmont, for helping us. And he's like, yeah, that's cool. I'm glad to help. Hey, could I get your ear about something? It's like, we've got a long history here, and we've got all of these groups that have been working and organizing towards Italian unification, and the Austrians seem to be the ones that are standing in the way. And Napoleon's kind of like, go on. And Cavour's like, oh, you're interested. Great. Here's what we need. What we need is French power that, if combined with the Italian nationalist spirit, could defeat the Austrians, and then we could achieve our goal of Italian unification. And Napoleon's like, yes. What is it for us? And Cavour's like, glad you asked. In exchange for the French army helping us defeat the Austrians and thus helping us unify Italy, we will offer you Nice and Savoy. And remember me telling you how Napoleon's like, chips, a win. All right? He's like, we're in. Let's do it. And then so the French army comes in, supports the Italians here. They quickly defeat the Austrians at a couple of battles. They were called Magenta and Solferino. The meeting was took place at this place called Plombières. All right? And so they're going to go after Lombardy and Venetia. They're going to take them away. Napoleon will get Nice and Savoy. Clean, easy peasy. All right? except the whole thing that I talked about with the Pope and the French Catholics and everything else. So what then took place is what we call the Dis of 1859. All right, that's where Napoleon dissed Cavour, and he had to because he had to save face with the French Catholics. So there's a peace treaty that is signed called Villa Franca, where Napoleon's like, oh, all right, I got to get out of this. So Austria, if you let them have Lombardy, you guys keep Venice. Cool? And the Austrians are like, yeah, sweet. And then Cavour finds out about it. It's like he got crushed. He got Blake Griffin. Found out he got traded to the Pistons. Right, so he's pissed. Right? And he's like, he resigns. He's like, I can't face the people that I promised unification to. I mean, I thought we were going to win, and then we got dissed. Right, so he was about to resign his post, except what he didn't realize was taking place was beautiful. Garibaldi heard about what was taking place. People all over the Italian peninsula started to hear about what was taking place, and they were making it happen on their own. Garibaldi and his red shirts ended up landing in Sicily, and they are liberating territory from the boot all the way up, from the football, from Sicily all the way up. All right, and now it's like it's done. Cavour like jumps back in, and he's like looking at it. He's like, "Hey, this is going to happen without France." But then he starts thinking that he's a pragmatist. Remember, that's what Realpolitik is. They know what they can get away with when they can get away with it. All right? And really, the Realpolitik thing only fits Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in domestic policy. But for Cavour, it was really the whole thing. And Cavour said, if Garibaldi liberates Rome, where the Pope is sitting right now, we potentially face a war against France. And if he continues even further into Venice, then we face a war against potentially France and the Austrians. So I got to stop him. And so he kind of gallops out to where Garibaldi's coming and kind of like takes him off to the side and says, dude, I know you got a lot of momentum and I know you guys are fired up, but we can't take Rome. All right, what we need to do is we need to declare this thing done and declare Italy unified, minus Rome and minus Venice. And so Italy is proclaimed in 1861, minus those two pieces. Venice is still controlled by the Austrians. Rome is still protected because the Papal States belong to, at the time, Pope Pius IX. And that way he avoids turning this Italian unification into an all-out war that could end up like nullifying the whole thing the way it did in 1848. So Cavour saves them by modifying the games. And are they going to get Rome and Venice eventually? Why? Because he makes friends with the crap master. Okay, so let's stop time on that. Miles or Joe or anybody, if you can just hit the stop button. All right, so what we're going to do tomorrow, and this is for you guys that are going to be here, is we're going to look at the crap master. All right. No, sir.